Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCK Week 2 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. A very fun Week 2 of LCK action. A lot of people who follow my channel know LCK Tuesday is one of my favorite days of the week. I get to talk about probably the region I have the most fun watching, if I'm being entirely honest, and that is the LCK. So if you are excited as well, let me know down in the comments section below. What series was your favorite of the week? There's a pretty easy decision, I think, for a lot of fans out there, as we had a top-of-the-table clash towards the middle of the week that definitely did not disappoint. But maybe outside of that one, which series did you guys find to be the most enjoyable? Of course, let me know down in the comment section below. And I just want to say this slightly before we jump into the video, because I don't think I've been promoting it enough. I did go ahead and start a TikTok. It's going to be linked down in the description. You can go ahead and follow that. I'm going to be posting little recapped versions of these videos, not only on that TikTok, but also on YouTube here as shorts. So if you don't feel like you can hit the entire, hour-long video right now, you want a small little recap, about a minute-long recap of what happened in the LCK this week, you can go ahead and check that out. And also, yeah, go ahead and give it a follow. I'm trying out some new types of content, and I want to know what you guys' thoughts and opinions are on that. So, don't only, sit here and watch this hour-long video. I mean, do that, obviously. But once you're done with that, go ahead and check out those little small recaps and let me know what you guys think of it. How can they improve? How can they not? Let me know down in the comment section of those videos as well. But let's not waste too much time on this intro. Let's jump right into some LCK Week 2 action. Of course, if you're new here, we go through all the series in the LCK here in Week 2, and we're going to be going game by game, talking about the pluses and the minuses for each team. So let's kick it off with day number 1. And day number 1 was kicked off with a matchup between Nongshim RedForce and Dplus KIA. And Dplus obviously was able to take this series. This really isn't a big shock to a lot of people. The top 2 teams in the LCK right now feel very separated from basically everyone else in the league. That includes Dplus KIA. Obviously, them and T1 are the top of the league, and I would argue that the bottom 2 teams also feel relatively separated. That, of course, being the Kwangdong Freecs, and then also Nongshim here at 9 and 10, in my opinion, in the power rankings. So to see Dplus just come out and be the better team in this series, it's not really all that surprising. What is relatively surprising is how well Nongshim actually fared in both of these games. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Game number 1, probably the closer game of the two, I would say, or at least it felt closer. A very early game-oriented comp from Dplus here. If I call them Damwon again, I apologize. I'm really trying to fix it. The name is awful, and so I've got to try and ingratiate it in my brain. But DK had a really early game comp here. You go for the Renekton, you go for the Jace as the double solo lane. You're really relying a lot on that Elise to be able to generate those early leads for those lanes, because you are eventually going to get outskilled by a Zeri comp. And, relatively speaking, she does have some level of threat outside. Nongshim has some level of threat outside of Zeri in that comp as well. And so you really need to make sure that you win the early game and start snowballing. Luckily for DK, Canyon was able to get the ball rolling very easily in game number 1 on the Elise. Kana actually has a phenomenal game on the Renekton. We will get to him and this series in general, but Kana's had such a fantastic start to the year, and I think Deft, it's just unfair. Stop giving him Lucian. I talked about this in the video last week. When are we going to no longer give Deft and Kellen Lucian Nami? Because it is genuinely becoming a problem for other teams to actually have to deal with them when they play these two champions. They are simply too strong and too good on them, and that's going to carry over into game number 2 as well. Kind of a different comp here, obviously a lot more late game focused. You still have the early game ideology of we can play towards Lucian Nami in the mid game, try and transition that out of control, but you've got the Fiora and the Sylas for side lane control towards the back half of the game. You don't really need to rely on a lot of these mid game skirmishes nearly as hard as you did with Renekton and Jace as your 2 solo laners, and so you're awarded a little bit more flexibility. I think game 1 was definitely more of a limit test for this Damwon, for this Dplus team, and I think they passed it. They went back to something a little bit more standard in game number 2, and they won that anyways as well. My player of the series, like I said before, is going to go to Kana in the top lane, who, man, what a bounce back year. Obviously playing his former team in this series, going up against Nongshim, and he certainly makes them pay. I mean, that Nongshim team was a disaster last year, and Kana certainly had some frustrations, I think, to take out on this team, as he played really well. That Renekton game in game number 1, he was just dominating Din Din in the top lane in the early parts of that game on the Aurelia, a very aggressive counter pick that you really need to capitalize on in the late game. Renekton is going to have a lot of pressure early, especially with that Elise being top lane so much, and so Kana really was just able to take that lead and transition it into some very, very nice Renekton plays. We can see the difference between when a very good player plays that champion and when an average player plays that champion very frequently here in the LCK. And then also, Kana's game 2 on the Fiora was really solid as well. He was just playing really, really consistent, really, really effectively, and that's kind of what you wanted to see out of Kana. This felt much more similar, I would say, to T1 Kana, obviously, than anything that was on Nongshim last year, where he was very erratic, very up and down in terms of his performance. It definitely felt like last year the team was just kind of combusting around him, so he felt like he had to be a little bit more of a carry presence. You can definitely feel the stability that DK brings him as a player. You can feel the stability that having Deft and Kellen on Lucian Nami in the bot lane brings a player like Kana for him to be able to play a little bit safer. He doesn't feel like he has to take over the game in the same kind of way. It just allows him to make plays when he feels like it, when he feels like the time is right. And DK has rewarded him by investing in him, by putting resources into him. This is not the first series of the year where they have felt that Kana was somebody worth investing a lot of resources in, which is crazy to say because you're looking at Showmaker and you're looking at Deft, and both of them are very good with resources as well. To feel like you can go to all three lanes if you are Canyon, who just might be the best jungler in the world, that is such a winning formula. It's actually very, very scary to have to put the game plan around, to have to try and deal with in prep. And so if Kana's going to play like this, it makes DK even tougher to have to deal with. But it's not just Kana. Obviously, Deft has started off the season at MVP pace. I mean, right now, it is absolutely ludicrous how well he is playing in that bottom lane. You know, I don't want to talk about Kellen versus Beryl and, like, the difference between the two, but there is a reason that I do rank Kellen slightly higher than Beryl as a support, and that is because I think Kellen is more adaptable. I think Beryl genuinely, as a support, is a very good player at playing his style, but he does kind of force his AD carry to play his style. Look at the champions that Deft was playing last year compared to what he's allowed to play this year. I know it's a lot of Lucian Nami, but he wasn't allowed to play Lucian Nami last year because Beryl doesn't like to play Nami. It's not really the style that they wanted to go for in the bot lane. Deft feels more unlocked to be able to play these more aggressive mid-game oriented AD carries in 2023, and it's made him look like the best AD carry in the league. I'm not going to say that's entirely Kellen, like, propelling him forward. I think Deft has just been unlocked a little bit more on this DK team, very similar to how I phrased it with Kana. It feels like this team and this organization and the structure of everything going on here has just helped propel these players to be a little bit better versions of themselves. And so Kana, Deft, definitely the standouts. Kellen has started off the year phenomenally. He had 3 deaths in the series. I believe that was more than the amount of deaths he had total in week number 1. Someone in the comments might be able to correct me on that, but he has been stellar to start the year as well. It's crazy to say, but I genuinely think Canyon and Showmaker are the 2 players on the team that have been the least impactful for DK over the first couple of series, and that is a good thing. Like, that is genuinely a great thing to say, because you know eventually they are going to be the ones that are going to carry the load, and we know they can do it. If we can see that everybody on the team has the ability to do that, I mean, DK looks like the scariest team in the league, maybe outside of T1. It is absolutely ludicrous how good they look right now. As for Nongshim, though, it's not a bad loss. Honestly, it could absolutely be worse, and that's kind of been the story of Nongshim so far. They are 1-4, 0-2. They lose another 2 games here to drop to 1-6. It's not a great record, but they've looked relatively competitive in a lot of their games. Sylvie, in particular, I think looked pretty solid in this series. Game number 1 really wasn't all that bad from him on the Sejuani. He goes to the Vi in game number 2, and I actually think he plays relatively well. He's able to set that Zeri up in game number 1 in order to be that late game hyper carry that I think Nongshim kind of needed in order to win the game. I think Nongshim did a really good job of capitalizing on their advantages and their strengths. They go for a more late game comp in game number 2, just trying to survive. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to survive against DK, who just plays the early game so aggressively, and most specifically plays the mid game so aggressively that it's very difficult to get to that late game power spike where your Zeri Azir comp can really come online. But, you know, credit to them. I really do think they put up a better fight than I expected them to. I thought DK was just going to completely blow them out of the water, and I don't think they did in this series. I think Nongshim at least looked competitive and at least looked relatively, you know, on a level playing field. You know, they're not the same kind of team. They're definitely not in the same category, but Nongshim didn't look like a team that didn't deserve to be in the same league as DK, which I think is a pretty good sign. Unfortunately, I do have to give a dud of the series, so for me, it's going to go to Din in the top lane. The Aurelia pick in game number 1 just didn't work, and it was a little bit disappointing. He didn't really do anything on Cassante in game number 2. I don't think anybody made, like, drastic mistakes on the side of Nongshim. I think you could say that Vital was mispositioned a couple times in game number 2, but he was, you know, really important to that comp in game number 1, and honestly, he kept the game relatively close for them. I don't think Fiesta was particularly great either, but I think when you're just looking at one person to give dud of the series to, for me, it's going to be Din in the top lane, although I don't think anybody played particularly bad. I actually think a player like Sylvie on Nongshim did actually play really well in this series, and I think in a different circumstance, it could have looked a little bit differently, but that's really the difference between playing a team like Dplus, you know, playing a team like, you know, no foreshadowing, but like KT Rolster or DRX or Hanwha Life or any of these other quote-unquote like upper-tier teams that maybe don't have it quite as much as the top two. There really is a large gap right now, I would say, between the very good teams and the other teams in the LCK, and I think DK showed that off a lot in this series. What do I think the outlook looks like for both of these teams? Well, Nongshim is competitive, but I really don't think they're going to be a team that competes for top 6. They have too many holes in their game. They're not really a team that is on the same level as I think a lot of the other teams kind of surrounding them, at least on paper. Now, a lot of these teams are slipping and falling. Obviously, the LCK has been very volatile to start the year, but I just would be surprised if Nongshim was able to keep up. For DK, I mean, they're one of the top 2 teams in the league. If they continue to play like this, they are going to be on a roll, and they are going to be a Worlds threat, not just an LCK threat. They really are playing at some of the top level, you know, one of the top levels of any team in the entire world, and I would expect that to continue basically for the whole year. Moving on to our second series here of day number 1. It was certainly one that I was intrigued to watch, and one that now that it's over, I'm even more intrigued to talk about. We had Liiv SANDBOX taking on KT Rolster, and Liiv SANDBOX with a big win here. Now, that's not the last time that we're going to be talking about some big, surprising wins this week. That I can spoil a little bit right now, but this is the first big one. Liiv SANDBOX being able to take down KT Rolster in 3 games. Big win for Liiv SANDBOX. They actually had a pretty up and down week in week 1. I know I wasn't super high on them coming out of the first week of the season, but that's because their loss to Dplus KIA was just so ridiculously demoralizing. They got stomped harder than anybody in the LCK in week 1 in that series, and it just wasn't close. It felt like that team very much had a few things that they needed to figure out in order to be competitive with the teams that I consider to be in that upper echelon, but maybe it was just Dplus, because Liiv SANDBOX comes into the series against a good team on paper in KT Rolster, and they look pretty good. Now, it's not perfect. They are a little bit lucky, I will say, to walk out of this with the win, but still, very good series from them overall. Game 1 is really where the luck comes in. This is a game that just should have been won by KT Rolster. They had the lead. They were in Elder Pit. Willer jumps in early on Elise, but absolutely no one goes on him. Cuz actually smites Willer, I believe, in this fight. And Willer, for what it's worth, is able to steal the Elder Dragon, and that completely turns the game. That allows Liiv SANDBOX to win, basically, from that moment onwards. Like, that team fight happens, KT loses the game, period. End of story. You know, that's unfortunate, but still, KT Rolster looks like the better team for a majority of Game 1, so you can kind of live with that. You can kind of move on with that. It sucks, but you can live with it. Game number 2, KT Rolster win. They actually don't look all that good in the early game, most specifically BDD, who just gets completely run over in the mid lane by Closer. I'll get to Closer in a bit, but he really has impressed me at the start of this year. But BDD did not look good in this series, and most specifically in this game number 2, but lucky for them, Lehens might actually still be one of the best supports in the world. He could not miss a Lux Binding. I mean, one of the most genuinely dominant Lux games that I've seen in quite a long time at a pro level. I mean, he was just fantastic. He carried this team to a win. You know, credit to aiming, he was doing damage, but this was Lehens' game through and through. BDD did his absolute best to try and lose them the game, but luckily for KT Rolster, their bot lane did play well in that game number 2. And then game number 3, honestly, Liiv SANDBOX was just better. There's really no other way to put that. This was the first game in the series where Liiv SANDBOX really just felt like the better team off the back of this jungle mid duo, which just continues to look really good. Now, I want to give a ton of credit to bot lane as well. Envy and Kale, I went into the year not really super hyped about this bot lane. I was really high on Kale last year. You can go back and watch a lot of the videos. I voted for him for Rookie of the Year in the LCK. I thought he just was the Rookie of the Year over Vikla. I thought he was more important to his team's success than Vikla was, although I think Vikla is a good player. I thought Kale was also a really good player, but I was worried that Envy coming in to replace Prince was just going to be too massive of a downgrade for it to matter. I think Envy might have been the worst AD carry going into 2023, and so there was a lot of expectation that this team's bot lane was going to be a little bit of a problem. But now you're going up against Aiming and Lehens, and honestly, in game number 3, you just absolutely brutalized them. I'm so tired of teams being willing to trade this Zeri for the Lucian. I think at this point, we can safely say it's not working. It has legitimately, look it up, like a 10% win rate in all major in all major regions. It is absolutely absurd that teams still feel like this is a fair trade to make. The Lucian is always going to have pressure in that lane, and as long as they don't screw up, they're going to have pressure the whole game, because once you get ahead on Lucian, he is very difficult to regain a lead on, and even if Aiming did play okay in game number 3, it doesn't really matter. Envy played so much better, and Kale played so much better that it really just caused KT to not have a win condition on the team, because when you draft Zeri, it immediately becomes a Zeri comp, and so great series for Liiv SANDBOX. I have to give player of the series to Willer, and one thing I want to talk about here with Willer, watching him play at the beginning of this year makes me question Hanwha Life even more as an organization, because you had him on the roster all of last year, and yet you continued to play on Fleek. You brought in on Fleek in order to play over him, who you could make a real case was one of the worst, if not the worst player in the LCK over summer of last year. Willer was on that roster. He was someone who went to Worlds with this team. We saw growth from him on Hanwha. He comes over to Liiv SANDBOX, and now he looks really good. Yes, going up against Cuz, who I'm notoriously low on, but still, Willer deserves player of the series here. Obviously, the clutch steal in game number 1, but what a game number 3 for him on the Wukong. Really a dominant early game performance from him to snowball the game out of control. Again, I want to give a lot of credit to Bertle. His laning has improved so much. It really felt like that was always his weakness on Damwon last year when he got that chance to play before Nuguri joined the team. He felt like someone who was going to be fine once he got to those late game scenarios, but his laning was problematic. His laning was really good in this series against another good laner in Keen, and then Closer just knows how to play these assassins super well. I'm still a little bit concerned with how he plays things like the Azir, although I do think he played it relatively okay towards the back half of game 1. I think it's definitely a different story when he gets to play his Akali, when he gets to play his Ahri, versus when he gets to play some of these more control mage backline teamfight champions. I think Closer is a player that is growing. I don't think he's a superstar yet. I think a lot of people are going to want to call him a top 4, top 5 mid laner in the LCK. I'm just not on board with that quite yet, but he is getting better. And then Envy and Kale, I could not have predicted them being this good to start the year. But for KT Rolster, I mean, disaster is starting to strike. You're shooting yourself in the foot for these wins. Game 1, it should have been a win. This should have been a 2-0 series win for KT, and the fact that it wasn't is honestly super disappointing for this organization and for this roster. Cuz completely throws the game away by wasting Smite on the Elise, and then he's not able to get the Elder Dragon. They're not able to kill the Elise in time, and so it's just kind of doomed. And then BDD gets run over in game number 2. Lehens is able to save it. Game number 3 isn't all that close because the bot lane has been given a losing matchup, and that, quite frankly, has been proven to be the only way that this KT Rolster team can consistently win games. And so, yeah, I'm starting to worry about KT Rolster. Not that they are a bad team by any means. Keen looked good in the series. I think Aiming and Lehens are still a decent bot lane. They're not superstars, which is what I said at the beginning of the year. No offense to Aiming fans. I know that there are a lot of people out there that wanted to see Aiming at number 1 or number 2 in my AD carry rankings, but they're not a superstar bot lane. They're not going to carry this team to wins by themselves. The other members of this team do have to step up and have to play, but at that same time, they are the only win condition for KT Rolster. If Aiming and Lehens don't win, KT Rolster likely do not win. We saw a game in week 1 that gave me some hope, where BDD played really well, but that seems to be a little bit of an outlier, or at least it's not going to be something that you can rely on consistently. Maybe he'll have games like that, but he'll also have series where he plays like this, which is not very good. Cuz is going to get my dud of the series. I am notoriously low on Cuz, and I think he showed why in this series. He just makes boneheaded decisions towards the back half of games. Yes, the Smite decision was moronic in game number 1. Even if he doesn't Smite in that game number 1, you're still at best calling this a 50-50, right? Like, and why would you 50-50 this? There is literally no reason to 50-50 this. If you just turn and fight, it is brainless. It is over. It's done. It's immediate. You have such a lead, but they don't want to do that. They go for the 50-50. They could lose that anyways, and so Cuz having a bad game 1, he had a bad game 3, kind of got run over on the Vi in game number 3 by Willer, who just played fantastic in that 3rd game. He's a problem for this team. BDD, while he has his moments, has been a little problematic in all of these teams' losses, in this team's losses so far. And so, if Aiming and Lehens aren't stepping up, I don't really see a lot of avenues for KT to win, and that does not, spell a very good team in the LCK. You can't really be losing to teams like Liiv SANDBOX, no offense, they've made a lot of improvements, but you can't really be losing to SANDBOX and consider yourself like a wannabe top 4 team in the league. It's just not where you can be right now, and so KT has a lot to fix. This jungle mid duo has to figure it out, or else they're not going to hit their ambitions. And honestly, if your only win condition is playing through Aiming, who is inconsistent at best, and I mean that as a person who, feels like he's relatively fair on Aiming, it's just not a recipe for a Worlds team, in my opinion. As for SANDBOX, great win here. You move yourself to 2-1. The record looks good. I'm still not super sold that this team is, dominant. They should not have been walking out of this series with the win. They should not have been given an opportunity to play a Game 3, but they were given that opportunity, and they made the most of it. I'm seeing a lot of development in a lot of their young players. Players like Willer and Envy in particular really stood out in this series. If they can continue to grow, if they can continue to get better, this is basically exactly what happened to this organization over the course of last year. I'm not saying that is going to be the exact same, but this team definitely has some promise, and I'm excited to see where they go in the future. Moving on to day 2 now. Day 2 was actually a pretty fun day for some LCK action, and we kicked that off with a bit of a blowout series as we saw Gen.G taking on BRION, and Gen.G does pick up the win. No real huge surprise here. Obviously, BRION with a fantastic week 1, going 2-0, going 4-1, but it was against maybe the 2 worst teams in the league in Nongshim and KDF, and so a lot still to prove for this Bro roster. They go up against their first real challenge of the year here, their first real test in Gen.G, and unfortunately, Gen.G is just too good for them. I think this is really a credit to what Gen.G has done this offseason. Obviously, they lost a lot of their key pieces. They lost their bot lane. They didn't lose anybody else, but they lost their bot lane. But their bot lane was their key piece last year. You have to remember, Ruler and the Hens, kind of the part of the team that they drove through, for the most part, for a majority of the regular season. Obviously, Peanut was a big reason for that, but you know, having Ruler, having Lehens both leave this offseason, it was a gaping hole that Gen.G needed to fill. Now they bring up a rookie in Pez. They bring up a very unproven player coming over from a BRION team last year in Delight. 2 players that really had major question marks on them going into the year. Pez maybe less so because he was just this superstar prospect coming out of the Challengers League in Korea. But Delight definitely had question marks for me. And you know what? They have really erased a lot of those at this point for me. Pez is going to get player of the series here. I'm not really going to go game by game for both of these 2 games because they were both very similar. Both of them were Pez and Peanut just taking over the game. It was really just jungle and AD carry, just like in 2022 for Gen.G. This was a very similar win for this organization to what they had a lot of last year, and it's crazy to say that because they lost the MVP of the league, and they're just doing it again with the rookie. It is really a credit to how good I think this jungle mid duo is, and I'll get into that as we talk a bit here. Like, how seamless I think this bot lane has transitioned into this roster, but really it is seamless. Pez and Delight are fantastic. Let's talk about them first. Pez is fantastic. I mean, he's everything that you could have wanted out of a replacement for Ruler and more. His positioning is great. His aggressiveness is great. He knows how to play within system. He knows how to be weak side. He knows how to be strong side. Most of the time, he is going to be strong side on this team because it very much looks like they want to play the exact same way that they did last year, which is fine. I certainly have no problem with that. That means Pez is going to be strong side for the most part. He got to play 2 games of Varus here, which is not exactly what I would consider super strong side, but lucky for him, he got to go into Jin twice, which is strong side. I think basically anybody playing into Jin right now is strong side because its early damage is just so minuscule compared to what a lot of these other champions can put out, especially if you're pairing him with like a Heimerdinger. You're pretty much going to have perma push in that lane. You have dive potential. You have pretty much perma control of dragons, etc., etc. And so Gen.G really capitalized on that. Pez was really dominant in the early parts of the game, but they transitioned a lot into these mid-game skirmishes near dragon in the bot side that really went their way. A lot of that was Pez, but I really do have to give a ton of credit to Peanut in this series. This is somebody who I think is very divisive in the community right now. A lot of people consider him the best jungler in the LCK. A lot of people consider him completely overrated. I think it's really just how you want to look at the situation. Peanut is not really the player that's going to win you games by himself. He's not really a player that is going to work as the best player on a team. Luckily for him, he's not the best player on this team, and I think that that is really good. I don't think that there is a single jungler in the world that makes his laners look better than Peanut does. I think that's really what he excels at as a player. Chovy can continue to be this more, I don't want to say scaling-oriented mid, but he's someone who doesn't have to take these ridiculous risks in the early game because you know he's going to be able to play the late game around, and then he's going to make Pez look like an absolute superstar. That's what he did with Ruler last year. Not to say Ruler isn't a superstar, or not to say Pez isn't a superstar without Peanut, but Peanut actively makes them look better. That trio right there of Peanut, Pez, and Delight, way more cohesive and way better than I ever expected them to be. I think that's going to be a big driving point for Gen.G as the year goes on, but Pez is my player of the series, close second place going to Peanut. On the side of BRION, not a great series. Honestly, going into Gen.G, you expected them to not really be able to hold their own. They're not really on the same level in terms of talent, but players like Hanwha and Effort really kicked off the season strong. I think you know, even started having some really good games to start the year. He wasn't even projected to be the starter, but obviously a lot of sickness problems going throughout BRION. Raptor wasn't going to get there in the start of the season, so was brought back in, and you know, he was allowed to play, and he was really good in week 1. I think he won his job basically back in week 1 here. I expect they're going to stick with him for a while. Unfortunately, on the side of BRION, they're just not on the same level. got completely out-jungled in this series by Peanut. It wasn't close at all. This was so much more similar to what we saw from in summer of last year than it was what we saw from him in week 1 when he was facing worse talent, quite frankly. Hanwha and Effort, who did have a good start to the year, were just giga useless in this series. I don't even mean to be rude, but Jin Karma is just not good, and it's especially not good when the enemy bot lane is just destroying you. And so they were at a point in time where Jin was not going to do any damage, and Karma really wasn't shielding anybody because you don't have this big team fight comp for Karma to really initiate him. You need to start getting picks with this comp, and I just don't think that was ever going to be possible with Peanut playing the way that he was on the Vi and on the Wukong in game number 2. And then my dud of the series is going to go to Morgan in the top lane. He wasn't particularly awful, but he just died a lot. Like, he went in and died. That's kind of the Morgan special, right? Is you pick a champion like Gnar, classic Morgan champion. You go in, you try to initiate, you get blown up immediately, and your team just loses the fight because you don't actually get anything done. That's kind of the big, like, oh, you know, top laners who play tanks are going to have more deaths. Yes, I get that, and I understand that Morgan having more deaths than everybody is expected, but his impact on the game was literally 0. I at least think Umti had some impact on the game. Henna and Effort had some impact on the game. Karis did some level of damage. I don't think Morgan did anything in this series, and that's unfortunate. So for me, he's dead of the series, although I think realistically, you could also give it to Umti. I think he was probably the most actively detrimental, but I do think he had some positive plays as well that kind of balanced it out. I think for the most part, Morgan was my dead of the series, but Umti also not very good. Overall for BRION, not a great series. This is not really what you wanted to see from a team that started 2-0, but it's not particularly surprising. This is a team that we always looked at overperforming in week 1. It's really good that they did separate themselves from the bottom tier of teams in the game right now in the LCK, but let's not kid ourselves. They're not going to be a team that challenges for top 4, top 5. Maybe they can sneak their way into 6 with how a lot of these teams are playing right now, but it's going to take a lot of effort. They got thoroughly dismantled by Gen.G in this series, and I think it does show that they are still rather low on the totem pole, in my opinion, and I was probably right not to jump them up into the top 6 after a 2-0 week 1. As for Gen.G, pretty much exactly what you wanted to see. They have established themselves as the 3rd best team in the LCK. I do think there is still a little bit of a difference between Gen.G and like Dplus and T1. I think that Gen.G is a very good team, though, and I think they are significantly better than whatever team you end up wanting to put in that number 4 spot. Whether it's Hanwha, whether it's KT, whether it's a team like Liiv SANDBOX, who's really overperforming. Whoever you want to put in that number 4 spot, I think Gen.G has proven that they are leaps and bounds more consistent and better than them at the current moment, and so I have a lot of faith for this Gen.G team, and it'll be interesting to see if they can outperform that ranking and perhaps even grow to start competing with the best 2 teams in the league. Moving on now to our second series here of Day 2. I talked about Day 2 kind of being fun, and that's mostly because it was 2 major blowouts. And you know what? This one was a blast to watch, if only because, God, what is this meta? We had a series between T1 and the Kwangdong Freecs that, of course, T1 won. I mean, what am I even talking about? Why are you even surprised? This is not a shock. This was the biggest lock of the week. However, Game 2, you know, was a little bit back and forth. A couple of interesting plays on the side of T1. Even then, it was still pretty one-sided. They pretty much always had control of the game. Certainly KDF's macro is struggling, but this is what a number 1 team in the league versus a last-place team in the league should look like. Like, this is what the best versus the worst should be looking like, and so I'm just going to skip talking about how these games went in particular, kind of like the previous one, and just kind of talk about the series as a whole. First of all, what the hell, man? Game number 1, you pull out the set mid. I kind of like this. Faker on set is a very interesting prospect. He's going to be able to do a lot of engaging for his team. That means his macro advantage is actually going to be able to be used, which a lot of the times it's just not on some of these more passive champions in the mid lane. It's why I like him on Assassins. It's why I like him on these more roam-oriented champions. It gives him the pressure to be able to do things, and he did a lot of things in game number 1. He was bot lane for 90% of this game. I swear that he just shoved mid, went bot. That was every single minute of this game for Faker. Respect to him, it got Keria super far ahead. Faker was so far down in gold and in CS and in XP, it didn't really matter because bot lane was super far ahead. I think people forgot that Gumayushi's really freaking good at Caitlyn, and so they gave him the Caitlyn. They picked the Lucian Nami. They don't even ban it out. Absolutely ego there a bit. I think they just forgot. Like, that's my only guess, is that they just genuinely forgot that Guma's super good at Caitlyn. He pulls it out after not having played it in basically half a year and dominates on it like usual, but this series, and I'll get to it, is all about Keria. Keria has the most gold on the team as Ashe support. You gotta love that. I mean, that's just kind of as good as it gets. Owner has a really good game on Elise, but really it's game number 2 where things start to get wild, where things start to get pretty improbable, pretty unbelievable. You're looking at the draft. You see it on the screen. You see it right. Caitlyn support from Keria. What are we doing? Like, where does this end? Where does the AD carries as support end? Where's the line drawn? Because I don't think Keria has that line. Obviously, he plays a ton of AD carry in solo queue. We've known it for years. There's that very viral clip of him just outplaying Viper on Ezreal, where I think Viper's playing Twitch, and he goes invisible, and Keria just tracks him the entire time, hits him with Ezreal Qs, and just kills him. Like, we know Keria is really good at these marksman picks, but to pull out Caitlyn support in pro against Yumi and to dominate on it, like to actively be the best player in the game is ridiculous. Obviously, there were some moments in this series where T1 looked a little disjointed. Owner had a really good game in game number 2, but some of those initiations were a little bit aggressive. Very similar with Zeus on the Jason game number 2. Some of the initiations were a little bit aggressive, but for the most part, I mean, they just dominated the entire map, and so they had the freedom to be able to do whatever they wanted. They had the freedom to be able to make a lot of the mistakes that they ended up making towards the back half of the game. And in the end, KDF traded Faker's life for Nexus. And you know what? What's more important, killing the Nexus or killing Faker? I mean, I've killed thousands of Nexuses, but I've never killed Faker, so who am I to really say? You know what I mean? But T1 is able to take this in 2 games. How could player of the series be anyone other than KIA? He pulls out Ashe in game number 1 and leads the team in gold. He pulls out Caitlyn supporting game number 2 and actually plays super well, is super impactful in a lot of these fights. KIA is so ridiculous right now. He is proving that he is just on another level from a lot of the other supports in the world. I love a lot of the other supports in the world. I've talked up a lot of those players like Ming, players like Missing, players like Mako, you know, even a player like Lehens in this region. They're all very explosive, but none of them truly are KIA. They don't offer what KIA can offer. To me, he is a clear-cut choice for the best support in the world right now, and I think he will prove that as the year goes on. He is a legitimate candidate for MVP the longer this season goes, but don't take it away from Guma. He followed up really well. That Caitlyn game in game number 1, you just can't give Gumayushi Caitlyn. I'm glad we've all been reminded of that. And then Varus in game 2, it does take a little bit of skill to have to play off of Caitlyn Trap as your only form of CZ in the bot lane, and so for them to be able to win that lane to Yumi, I do think did take a little bit of skill, but that kind of showed where Guma and KIA are compared to Taiyun and Moham, who we'll get to in a bit, but they're just not on that same level, right? Guma and KIA are just built a little bit different right now. That bot lane is insane. Faker played phenomenal. Like I said in game number 1, he was just roaming the whole series. Owner made some awesome plays in game number 2, specifically on the Sejuani. His initiations were great, and Zeus was just kind of taking the piss up in the top lane. He was fun to watch. He didn't necessarily take it all that seriously, especially towards the back half of game number 2, where it just felt like they were taking really funny fights. And so, overall, really good series from T1, but incredibly dominant. For KDF, I mean, they're just not on this level, right? Like, they are, it very much felt like a pro team facing an amateur team. Like, that kind of is what it felt like here. No offense to KDF. I hope they do get better, but they really have not looked good at all to start the year. I had a lot of people in my comment section telling me how this team was underrated coming into the year, and I haven't seen any bit of activity from them. Moham is still in as the support. Obviously, they brought in June as well to play with Taiyun, who they played together on DRX Challengers last year. I would have assumed that you wanted to keep that bot lane synergy together. That's why you brought them both in. But clearly, they like Moham. They played him a bit last year when KDF was really struggling. He has not been good to start the year. He's going to get my dud of the series here. He was just outplayed by KIA by a consistent margin, although I don't think that's like the worst thing in the world to say. KIA is pretty goated, and so to be outplayed by him, it could be worse, but that game number 1 specifically on Nami was just not good. How do you pick Lucian Nami blind when you leave Caitlyn up against one of the best Caitlyn players in the world? It's just incredibly disrespectful, and Moham and Taiyun, for that matter, definitely paid the price for that, but it's not like anybody on this team played particularly well. Youngjae, you know, no flame to him. Obviously, was very emotional after the series. I would be too. You got absolutely clobbered on a national stage, and that's not good, but, you know, he's got to play better. Him and Bulldog were really the bright spot of this team in week number 1, and they're going to have to be the bright spot for the team for probably the rest of the year, because I don't really see the bot lane ever really turning it around. They're probably just going to be the worst bot lane in the LCK, and Dudu in the top lane is not playing like he did last year on Hanwha Life. In my opinion, he was the best player on Hanwha Life last year. He has been irrelevant. I mean, completely inconsequential in the top lane to start the year. Hopefully that will change maybe when they're playing teams that aren't T1, but, I mean, they genuinely looked like an amateur team going up against T1. So, for the most part, KDF continuing the belief that they probably just are the worst team in the league, that they probably can't hang with a lot of the LCK teams, which is fine. It's kind of what we predicted going into the year. And then for T1, I mean, this is the number 1 team in the region. This could be the number 1 team in the world right now. They returned all 5 members from a team that went to World Finals last year, and somehow they look even more dominant right now. I mean, this team looks unstoppable. If they just keep up this pace, they're probably going to cruise to another LCK trophy. Moving on to the start of day 3 here in the LCK, we had an interesting match of 2 teams that have gone on to be winless to start the year in their combined first 5 series, but unfortunately, one of them actually had to win this series, and one of them definitely did in pretty convincing fashion. We saw Nongshim RedForce take on DRX, the reigning world champions, and they still can't buy a win. This is another loss, although they get their first game win of the year in game number 1, although we'll get to it. This was a 3-0 for Nongshim. I mean, this really was. Like, you can talk about how DRX won Game 1. DRX did not win Game 1. Nongshim lost Game 1, and then they dominated Games 2 and Game 3. So, I don't know. Nongshim looks pretty good. DRX looks pretty bad. Let's start talking about it. Game number 1. Nongshim has complete and utter control of this game. You're looking at this comp. You see a Renekton. You see an Akali. You see a Lucian. You got plenty of ways to break through this, you know, strong frontline, quote-unquote, of K'Sante and Maokai. They're not going to be able to hold up, especially with how Krako played in game number 1, which was genuinely terrible. K'Sante really doesn't have any gold. He's not going to be able to tank through all of this damage. You have tons of tools to be able to get on the Zeri and the Azir in the backline. You're not really going to be able to team fight. And so what do? You go for Baron, and that's great. You know, that's fine. You look like you're going to secure it without a lot of trouble. You take a little bit of time to get there. You see, like, Elise, Lucian, Nami, all, you know, think about it a bit, you know, kind of take their time and then start going for it. And it feels like Nongshim's got this. So Fiesta teleports away. Meanwhile, Krako jumps into the pit, steals the Baron. They are able to fight with the Baron. They're able to push in through, and they're able to end the game. Oops, that's not supposed to happen. Obviously, you can make fun of Fiesta for teleporting away what was probably a fantastic place to be. You know, if you get that Baron, you end the game. But I understand the idea. It looked like it was completely done. And honestly, from Fiesta's point of view, it should have been completely done. But Sylvie, Vital, Peter, they take way too long trying to get that Baron or deciding whether or not to take it. It allows DRX to get there in time. It allows them to be able to fight over it. And they're able to steal it. They're able to win the game. It's fine. It's just game number 1. Game number 2, a complete Nongshim dominated game. Fiesta gets his Sylas. They do a good job banning out the Azir this game and making sure that you can put Fiesta on something that can be more proactive. They take the K'Sante for themselves on the side of Nongshim, and I really do think that means a lot. Fiesta absolutely pops off on Sylas, a champion that we're really not seeing a lot of people have these kind of pop-off performances on, but a really good game, too, from Fiesta. He has continued to look very promising. I was very high on him going into the year. I think I talked about this Sylvie and Fiesta as a duo in my power ranking video, my player ranking video. I said that if this team was going to overperform expectations, it was likely going to be because of these two players, them and Peter. I think we're the 3 players on this team that I was super high on going into the year. It's the reason I had them ranked above a team like BRION in my power rankings, but Fiesta looks great in game number 2 here. And then game number 3 really was all Nongshim again. It was off the back of Sylvie. Din does a great job in the top lane, just brutalizing Rascal on this K'Sante pick, where if you get ahead, it's unstoppable. I didn't even really talk about this, but both in game 1 and game 2, Peter played phenomenal on this Nami in particular. He honestly, and this is going to be big praise, reminded me of Keria on that pick. I think that there were a lot of moments where it just felt like he could not miss a bubble, which is genuinely kind of a hard ability to hit at a pro level when pro players know how to dodge. And so very, very good series overall from Nongshim. I honestly think most of the players on this team looked about as good as you're going to get. Fiesta's going to be my player of the series. He continues to look like the driving force, the carry, if you will, of this Nongshim team. If they continue to look like, if Fiesta looks like this in the mid lane all season long, this team is definitely going to outperform expectations. But he was just so much better than Fate in the series that it was honestly not fair. You could say a very similar thing about Sylvie in the jungle, who has continued to look really good this week as well. I actually thought he was relatively good into Canyon in their series against Dplus, where, you know, they did kind of get run over, but for the most part, like, Nongshim held in there a lot better than I think a lot of other teams would. Sylvie was just so much better than Krako in the series that it honestly wasn't even fair. Sylvie and Fiesta as a duo, if they can really click and stay on the same page, I mean, they could genuinely be one of the more interesting jungle mid duos as the season progresses. I also think that Vital and Peter are stepping up. Vital is still a player that I'm relatively questionable on. I don't necessarily think he's a superstar or anything, but Peter is. Peter legitimately could be a superstar support in this region. It is a little bit off and on with him. Sometimes he has these games where he just makes his team better, and sometimes he's absolutely running it. But in this series where they were winning, he looked unstoppable. He genuinely looked like one of the best supports in the region going up against Dectum and Beryl. Now, I know they haven't had the best start to the year, Dectum and Beryl, but they're no slouches either. This is, you know, I know Dectum gets a lot of flack. He gets a lot of hate, especially on Twitter and on Reddit and on social medias. I don't think he's a bad player at all. In fact, I think he did a lot of really good things in this series, which we'll talk about when we get to the DRX, you know, segment, but Peter just outplayed him in the series. Always knew where he was going to be, was able to completely track his movements, and was able to completely track his dodge ability, I guess, with these Nami Qs and being able to set up a lot of these plays for Vital, for Fiesta to capitalize on. Din also had a fantastic game 3 on the K'Sante, absolutely brutalized Rascal. Overall, Nongshim just looked really good in this series. As for DRX, I mean, it is panic time. Your roster is looking not good. Rascal has been the only player on this team that has shown any level of consistency, and he had his worst series of the year by a large margin in this this, just quite frankly getting outplayed by Din. I think the best player on this team throughout the series for DRX was Dektum. I think he was at least making plays, especially in game number 1 where he was holding down the fort and was probably the biggest reason why DRX was able to win that game in the first place. I know he's going to get a lot of hate because he didn't play particularly well in games 2 and 3, but they would not have won game 1 without Dektum. If their AD carry was super far behind in that game when it doesn't matter if Krako steals Baron, they really aren't able to do anything. But it really is starting to become an issue how bad this jungle mid duo is. Krako and Fate might genuinely be the worst jungle mid in the league. Like, they are playing like it right now. Krako might be the worst jungler in the league. He has been horrendous to start the year, which is such a shock because I was such a huge fan of Krako going into this year. I thought he was really important to that SANDBOX team last year. I thought he was super good in 2021 as well. To see him come over to DRX and just completely lose it, like actively just not have a brain in the first 15 minutes of the game, is very concerning. He was a very easy choice for dud of the series, and I think you could give him a very clear choice for dud of the year so far in the LCK. He has gone from being one of the more interesting junglers in the entire region, like top 4 junglers in Korea, down to like, should this guy even be in the LCK over the course of 3 series? It has been that drastic on the side of Krako. Yes, he got the Baron steal in game 1, but the reason they were losing that game in the first place was how bad he played on the Maokai through the first 15 minutes of that game. So it's really hard to take that away. I think Fate has also been genuinely awful for this team. He really has offered basically nothing. He did good damage at the end of game 1 on Azir, but it's not like he won that matchup. Fiesta beat him on the Akali in the early part of that game. And then games 2 and 3, he was nowhere to be seen. Like, this jungle mid is just a problem, and I don't expect this team to get all that much better without fixing it. Dektum and Beryl have had some games, Rascal has had some games, but jungle mid is the most important role in the game right now, and if you lose it as hard as these two have been losing, it is essentially irrelevant how good the other players on DRX are playing. And even then, like, it's not like Dektum, Rascal, and Beryl have been consistent by any means. They've been incredibly inconsistent, and yet Krako and Fate are still losing. That is why this team is now sitting at 1-6 and 0-3 in terms of match scores. It's because they really just don't have any cohesion together, and they haven't had basically a single game this entire year where more than 2 players on this team have played even okay, which is problematic. So the outlook for DRX, they legitimately might just be one of the worst teams in the league. They just lost 3-0 to a team that hadn't won a series all year long, a team that had only won 1 game, and that is awful. Like, that is about as bad as it gets. Like, this DRX team is in full panic mode for me now. Something has to change or else they are just going to be miserable for the rest of the year. And then for Nongshim, they certainly showed some good things in this series. I'm not going to buy entirely in yet. I still think they've looked, you know, up and down over the course of their first few series. It's not the record. I know a lot of people are talking about them passing the eye test, and I agree with that somewhat. I do think Sylvie and Fiesta have been a little bit exploited by the good teams in the league. They've just looked okay against some of the worst teams in the league, and so I think Nongshim sitting at 9, it's not like the worst ranking in the world. I imagine they're going to be sitting around bottom 3 by the time the power rankings end. This is the end of their week 2. They played both of their series, but, you know, they do have some upside. Sylvie and Fiesta in particular look pretty solid, and I wouldn't be surprised if Peter just turns into one of the better supports in the entire league. I think this team definitely has some interesting features, and for them to have such a confident and confidence-boosting win here over DRX, I think is only going to help them moving forward. Jumping into our second series here of day 3, we had a matchup I was very excited for on paper because both of these teams have been a little bit disappointing to start the year, but let me say, one has certainly proven themselves to be more competent than the other. We saw a matchup between KT Rolster and Hanwha Liiv Esports, both teams that I think had a lot of promise going into the year. Golly, what is going on with Hanwha, though? KT rolls them. I mean, this is a rolling. It is 2 combined kills across 2 games for Hanwha Liiv, a supposed super team going into the year. 2 world champions, arguably the best AD carry in the world, a support that was really solid, and a former top jungler. And they just look completely and utterly incompetent. Good for KT. This is a good bounce back from earlier in the week where they did lose their series to SANDBOX, although I think you could say that, you know, they kind of had that series in hand before they eventually threw it away to SANDBOX. Credit to them for winning, but KT kind of had it in the bag before they fumbled it and lost it. This was just KT from start to finish. Game 1, Game 2, it did not matter. I mean, this was as perfect a performance as this team could probably put out at all possible throughout the first couple of weeks of the season. I want to talk about the 2 main players that I think are going to come to mind for a lot of people watching the series for KT Rolster. The first is going to be my player of the series here, Lehens, in the support position. He is proving why he was considered one of, if not the best support in the world over the course of the majority of 2022, and it's because his ability to take over games is more so than a lot of other people in that position. He had a fantastic game number 1 on Karma, still a very, very good game number 2 on Leona. This was a takeover performance from a support, which you just don't often see at the LCK level. Liiv is still one of the best supports in the entire world. I was worried about his fit with aiming. It seems like Liiv is going to take more of an initiator and more of an aggressive role in this relationship, which is expected, but aiming actually playing a lot more aggro to follow him up on some of these more, you know, in and out champions, things like the Ezreal, things like the Varus, things that can do damage, while also being relatively safe, I think is a super good win condition for a team like KT Rolster. I've talked about this in their previous series. It is aiming and Liiv that this team needs to play through in order to win games. Lucky for them, Liiv absolutely stepped up. Aiming was also very good in this series. I don't want to take it away from him. I just think Liiv was just a tad bit better, in my opinion, was a little bit more explosive and was the reason they were getting a lot of these plays, especially in that game number 1. But also, the other player I really want to talk about, big credit to Keen in the top lane. I've said his name so rarely over the first few series here for KT Rolster. In fact, I think this might be the first major time that I'm talking about him in 2023 because he really has been kind of a non-factor for KT Rolster so far. Cuz and BDD have been a little bit of a liability for this team so far, and aiming and Liiv have been trying to win them games. Keen has been somewhere in the middle, not necessarily winning them, but not necessarily losing them games either. Game number 2, though, fantastic game from Keen. Easily his best of the year and his best on KT Rolster so far. He absolutely obliterated Kingen in this one, and we'll talk about Kingen. He was awful. We'll talk about a couple of players on Hanwha who were just awful, but Keen and Liiv really were the two players for me that completely stood out for KT Rolster at the start of this. Cuz had a fantastic bounce-back game. Obviously, he's always known how to smite. He's just struggled at everything else, and I actually thought he was really, really solid in this. Out-jungled Klid, although that's not really an accomplishment with how Klid has been playing to start the year. He definitely was significantly better. BDD was solid. Like I said, aiming was really good. KT honestly just looked really good. It was Keen and Liiv kind of leading the way for me, but everybody on KT just dominated. I mean, this was a stomp for a reason. On the side of Hanwha Life, I have a bit more to say about them because what the hell is going on? I mean, this is unbelievable. Like, this is just completely... How do I even process this series? You know what I mean? I'm almost at a loss for words when it comes to how Hanwha performed. This is a team full of good players. They're certainly not playing like it. Kingen and Liiv had two of the worst series that I've seen in quite a long time. It honestly felt bad that I had to only pick one dud of the series because Kingen deserved it, Liiv deserved it, Viper deserved it, Klid deserved it. Pretty much everyone except for Zeka deserved it. It's not like Zeka played particularly fantastic. He just wasn't actively losing the game like everyone else on his team was. I mean, it was just a disgraceful performance from this Hanwha Life team. I am going to give dud of the series to Liiv in the support position. He was running it on Heimerdinger. I mean, this is maybe one of the worst support performances I've seen all year long. It was just genuinely terrible. Game 2 on the Lux certainly was not that much better. You're playing Caitlyn Lux into Varus Leona. I do understand that Varus Leona is okay into Caitlyn Lux. I understand that that's not the worst matchup in the world, but you still should have a ton of prio and a ton of pressure there, especially considering the fact that you're playing Sedge into Elise. I mean, you can basically just ignore the bot lane if you are Sejuani, because Elise is going to want to play for her more explosive lanes, you would think, right? Not super easy for an Elise to get onto Caitlyn Lux and actually secure that kill, and so I wouldn't expect her to play mostly for bot lane, but it didn't matter. Viper and Liiv were going to lose no matter what. They have negative synergy together. I don't actually think they are all that good this year, like, on their own either. Liiv has been very bad to start the year. Viper really hasn't been good either. It's just a shocking performance with how bad this bot lane has been. I think on paper, these two looked like they would bring the best out of each other, but quite frankly, they have exclusively brought the worst out of each other, and you just gotta hope that changes. Haven't seen anything between the two of them to expect it to change. You just gotta hope it will change. Kingen has very much reverted to 2020, 2021 Kingen, not so much 2022. It's not like he was perfect over the course of 2022 either. Obviously, he had a great World Finals in particular, but it's not like he was great all over that year. He was just very solid as a weak side top laner. He got run over by the better player in Keen in this performance, and it's really not all that surprising that Keen is better than him. What's surprising is that he's this much better than him, right? Like, Kingen rolled over and died. Like, there was no pushback, there was no fight. It just feels like the mental of HLE is so ridiculously broken that these players don't even want to try to win right now. Klid is maybe the worst player in the region right now. Zeka went 0-0-0 in game 1. He's absolutely trying his best to not run it, but it doesn't matter. He can't create advantages for his team because nobody else on the side is winning. HLE is legitimately doomed if they do not turn something around. It is insane how ridiculously bad they looked in this series. They looked incompetent. We've talked about KDF and even a team like DRX just looking completely and utterly unplayable at this level. Throw HLE into the mix. Like, they really have not shown it so far this year. They have won a series, but it was a really easy series to win. And so you're looking at a lot of the series that they've had against actually good teams, and they really have not been able to keep up. And so There's a lot to take away from this, but the big takeaway for me is that Hanwha needs to fix it now, or else they are doomed for the rest of the year. This is a roster that can't afford to not make playoffs, let alone not make Worlds, right? Like, they are really looking at, you know, this was a team that wanted to make Worlds. That was their intention going into the year. They might not be top 6. It really is that simple, and so a lot to fix for HLE right now. Everything is going wrong. For KT Rolster, this is exactly what you needed. Wasn't exactly the best start to the week. Wasn't exactly the best end to last week either. You were sitting at 1-2. You really needed a bounce back in order to inspire confidence, and you obliterated Hanwha Life. I'm not going to forget about all the problems I have with KT Rolster right now, most notably the jungle and mid duo, but Aiming and Lehens do look like a part of the map that you actually can win through. Keen had his best series of the year, and he hasn't necessarily been a problem for this team. There are positives for KT Rolster, and quite frankly, that is just more than I can say about most LCK teams in the league right now. That's going to bring us to the one you were all waiting for, the matchup between the two top teams in the league as we kicked off day number 4 here. I'm not going to pretense it. It's T1 versus Dplus KIA. This is what we have been waiting for all season long. Clearly the two best teams in the region, perhaps two of the best teams in the entire world, facing off against each other in a best of 3, and it did not disappoint. This was series of the week, easily. If you have not watched it, go watch it right now before I tell you all of the fun stuff that happened in it, but a fantastic series from both teams. T1 is able to pull it out in the end. T1 proves that their synergy, their ability to roll back the roster that they had last year, and just their general, I don't know, form that they're in, is better than, unfortunately, what Dplus has going for them right now, although it really could have gone either way, especially in game number 2. Let's talk about game number 1 first. Super fun game. Canyon's a monster. I mean, it is legitimately unreal how good Canyon is. And I think the thing that impresses me the most when it comes to Canyon is just how meta-proof he is. He can play tanks, he can play carries, he can play gankers, he can play farmers. It does not particularly matter what is meta. Right now, like in the jungle, Canyon will do it, and he will do it better than almost anybody else in the entire world. That is just what he does. A great game of Sejuani in game number 1 where he seals that game towards the back half with a very nice smite. Big credit again to Deft and Kellen, who continue to look unstoppable. They actually have to play against the Lucian Nami in game number 1, which is finally, like, where has this been? Like, why are people not picking it against them? And you know what? It didn't matter. His Zeri was phenomenal. It was basically unstoppable. I understand the idea of T1 not giving over Lucian Nami at all in this series. We'll get to why I think that mattered when we get to games 2 and 3, but game number 1, Deft and Kellen looked phenomenal on this Zeri. Yuumi, Canyon looked great on this Sejuani, and while Kana did miss a pretty crucial ult on Gnar in that team fight around the Dragon Pit, it was matched by Zeus, unfortunately mistiming his ult on Deft, who had Guardian Angel, was not going to be able to actually do anything with it, and so they end up losing that fight, they end up losing that game, but again, very close. I want to give credit to Showmaker as well, a very important seismic shove in that final team fight on the Taliyah as well. But then game number 2 rolls around, and this is where it gets back and forth. I mean, this is a super duper close game. You gotta give a ton of credit to Gumayushi, who is just playing out of his mind. Guma and Keria are just on a different level when it comes to bot lanes right now. Even Deft and Kellen, who I think you could argue have been the best bot lane in the LCK. Like, Guma and Keria looked unstoppable in this game number 2. They show why Lucian Nami is that superior bot lane, even if these two bot lane players are relatively equal. Guma just looked unstoppable there. Keria looked perfect on this Nami, as he basically always does. And credit to Owner, he gets the smite off at the end of this game, and that's really where it matters. They're able to clean up the fight. They're able to end the game. Zeus does a little bit of trolling. He still looks a little bit off here in game number 2, but for the most part, T1 looks solid. It's very back and forth, though. Certainly not a dominant win by T1 by any stretch. And then you look at this unbelievable game 3 comp. Keria pulls out Kalista support. He's just going down the marksman tab and just playing everything he absolutely can. Doesn't matter at this point. He played Caitlyn earlier in the week. He plays Kalista now, obviously. I don't know what to say. Keria is too good. How do you play Kalista support? Throw your Draven in with ultimate, have everyone kill him, and then win the fight because of it. Like, that is legitimately the most unreal strategy that I've ever seen towards the back half of these games. But when you have so much damage on the side of T1, it is really difficult to break through when you have that lead that you were able to generate. Keria was spectacular in laning phase on this Kalista, was actually really punishing towards the Lulu, which is really something that I would not expect to be able to happen. The Draven did get super far ahead, enough so that they could actually use his lead to be able to translate that into getting Kassadin level 16 towards the back half of the game, and that's what happened here, is Gumayushi could get thrown in, he could do all his damage as burst, and then you could have Faker following up doing a ridiculous amount with the Kassadin. I think you could give player of the series here to a few players. Guma absolutely deserves it. Faker absolutely deserves it for his play on Kassadin. and just his play through all 3 games, which we'll talk about in a bit. But for me, player of the series is again going to go to KIA here. He just is that difference maker at the support position. I think if you have a less talented, less versatile, less innovative support here on T1, I don't think the team is nearly as impactful. Not to say that I think, you know, trading Guma out for an average ADC makes them, you know, not worse, and, you know, same thing with Faker, right? Like, if you trade any of these players out for average players, they're not the team that they are, but I think KIA's impact is being felt the most directly, and I think adding on to that, the fact that he has the most interesting and fun picks in the entire game, like, he is the standout of T1. He is the MVP of the league right now for me. He is the player that I think about when I think about 2023 LCK League of Legends, and that certainly says something. So for me, KIA is going to get player of the series here. He genuinely was fantastic on that Lucian Nami, especially in Game 2, and then the ridiculous Kalista pick in Game number 3, but again, very, very close to picking Faker for this. An unstoppable Kassadin game once he hit that level 16. As soon as it ticked over, you knew he was going to dominate, but big credit to Faker. He was just better than Showmaker in the series every single laning phase, and it really wasn't all that close. That's where I really start to get, like, excited when it comes to this team, because Faker's weakness over the past year and a half or so has kind of always just been his early laning. He's been good at it, but he hasn't necessarily been on the same level as Chovy or Showmaker or even someone like Zeka, like these really big lane powerhouse players. He dominated Showmaker in lane in this series. He was up every single game. In the Azir Taliyah matchup, he was winning. In the Azir Akali matchup, he was winning. In the Kassadin Ryze matchup, he was winning. It was absurd. Very good series by Faker, and in 99% of cases, he would have gotten player of the series. KIA was just that good. Again, Guma was also spectacular. You give him his signature Draven. You put them on Lucian Nami. It doesn't really matter. Guma is playing at an all-world level right now, and if they keep it up, like, this is the best bot lane in the world at current moment. Deft and Kellen are certainly in that conversation as well, but Guma and KIA really are on, like, a ridiculous playing field right now. And then Owner was good, had a kind of a weak game 1, but definitely bounced back in games 2 and 3, really secured a lot of those objectives. Zayu's still showing a little bit of up and down play, but for the most part, he's been good. On the side of DK, they looked fantastic in this series. It's really hard for me to talk about them because they did end up losing it, but basically everybody in this series played great. These were 10 fantastic League of Legends players. I had to give dud of the series to someone, and so for me, it is going to go to Showmaker. I know he was really good in a lot of these late game team fights, specifically in Game 1 on the Taliyah, but his laning was kind of problematic. He allowed Faker to get really big leads on champions like Azir, on champions like Kassadin that really mattered towards the back half of those games. If Faker was more behind, I think there would have been more urgency from T1 to try and force plays towards the mid part of this game. However, T1 never felt the need to do that, especially in game number 3, so they could take their time, they could make sure Kassadin levels up, and then as soon as they get there, they can end the game. I think a lot of that was because Showmaker didn't have the same kind of agency in lane that someone like Faker did, which was problematic. However, Showmaker was incredibly influential in game number 1 for them winning. That seismic shove in the dragon fight was absolutely huge, and so, you know, I feel really bad giving him dud of the series, but it's just, he was the one player that I was looking at, especially in games 2 and 3, where I felt, you know, they probably lost the most amount of pressure there. I think Kana had some moments where he wasn't so good whiffing that Gnar ult in game number 1, you know, but he was a tank for the most part. He didn't actually make that many mistakes. He was pretty influential in these team fights. Canyon was God mode in this series. Deft and Kellen were fantastic, especially in their game 1 win. There really felt like there was only one option, although all 10 players really did play well in this series, and so I can't speak highly enough of how Dplus played this series. They looked like one of the best teams in the world. It's just unfortunate that they had to run into another one of the best teams in the world in T1, and so outlook-wise for these two teams, they are clearly the two best teams in the LCK. This series was everything it was ever supposed to be and more. These top-of-the-table clashes in the LCK always live up to expectations, and this one was certainly no exception. I think Dplus is going to rebound well after this loss. I don't think it's going to kill their mental. They're going to continue to be one of the best teams in the league, and I'm very excited to see these two teams face off again later in the year. And for T1, you are absolutely rolling. It doesn't really seem like there's going to be any team in the LCK, maybe even the world, that is going to be able to easily take down a team like T1. They right now should be the favorites to win MSI, and that's a pretty big statement that I feel a lot of confidence in. Jumping into our second series of Day 4, it's certainly a series that has slightly different stakes than the one that we just mentioned, but honestly, they are still relatively important as one of these teams is going to end the week 3-1. We had a matchup between Liiv, SANDBOX, and BRION, and SANDBOX picks up another strong victory here. They really do look good, and they look really good this week in particular. Now, I don't know how long it's going to last. I'm not going to say that these players are bad, but it is quite fortunate for them that so many teams in the league are underperforming so heavily right now, Bro is not one of them. SANDBOX should be better than Bro. I want to make that abundantly clear. And them being able to win this series is good for them. You know, credit to Bro for being able to hang in it, especially Game 2, very close. Games 1 and 3, not so close, but, you know, this is kind of how I would have expected this series to go. But SANDBOX sitting at 3-1, that's going to be really, really big for them. They're going to need to cling on to that. They're going to need to use that as momentum to build into the future. I'll get to that more, I guess, after we talk about this series, but for them to be sitting here at 3-1, they've got to be incredibly excited and incredibly happy. So let's talk about this series. In game number 1, Bro was able to take it off the back of some really good jungling from Umti. I'm actually really impressed with how he has started the season. He has easily, in my opinion, been the best player on BRION over the course of the beginning part of this year, and I think that is not something I would have said. Now, Hanwha and Effort have also been relatively good. Hanwha, in particular, I think has really stepped up considering what he was most of last year, but Umti has kind of been the carry, I would say, for BRION over the course of their first few wins, over the course of their first 4 or 5 wins of the season so far. Umti really has been that guy. I don't expect to see him losing his spot to Raptor now, even if Raptor is better. I think Umti will be sticking in at least until he proves otherwise. A really good game of Sejuani. This is how you play that champion. Even on a lower damage comp, like you're looking at, you know, Ryze and Varus is lower damage compared to some other, you know, comps that you've seen played with Sejuani. Still a very dominant game from Umti. Game number 2, very back and forth, but it ends in a way that is so poetic and so justifiable. It, of course, ends with a Willer Elder Dragon flip. And Liiv SANDBOX is able to pick it up. Bro was in a pretty good position before that, but Willer, the god of Smite himself, is able to get it. He's able to take it. This is his specialty. It's what he does. They're able to win the game. You know, credit to Willer. He kind of got out jungled for a good majority of that game, but he did bounce back in the part where it mattered the most, which was towards the end. Now, he was really bad in game number 1. I want to point that out. Kale was also really bad in game number 1 on the Ashe, but we'll talk about him. He was actually really good over the course of games 2 and 3, in my opinion, but Willer definitely super influential in being able to win that game too. Closer does a lot of damage in the back half of that game on the Azir. They're really kind of in a rough position, I think, generally speaking. Credit to the Ashe, credit to the Azir. They're able to pull it back. Even credit to the Fiora. Honestly, in my opinion, Bertle was probably the most impactful member of SANDBOX in game 2 for a majority of the game, but, you know, without Willer, you don't win that. Without him taking the Elder Dragon, you don't win it. And so, credit to Bertle, credit to Willer, even credit to Closer, who I do think had a good game too. And then game number 3 was SANDBOX from moment 1. This was the most dominant game of the series by a large margin, and the best I can say is Closer's Aurelia. Like, this is what happens when you give him the champions that he is best at. He got to play Cassid in the series. He got to play Aurelia. You just need to add Akali onto that list, and he gets to play the whole trifecta of his signature champions. Closer always is going to look super good on the champions that he's super good at, and I do think he did in the series. However, I think the thing that is most impressive for me is he does seem to be getting a little bit better at the Azir pick in particular. It's something he's going back to a lot over the course of this year. It's something he played a lot over the course of last year and was honestly not good at, and so to see him be good at it this year, or at least, you know, much better at it this year, I think is definitely, you know, a good thing. I think for the most part right now in the meta, it's okay if you're not, like, super comfortable on control mages. It's fine if you want to play the Victor, or it's fine if you don't want to play the Syndra, right? Like, those champions I think are okay not to pick, even if they are, you know, playable. Even something like the Ryze, something that are, you know, some picks that are more passive, you know, not as aggressive, not as kill-oriented. That's not really Closer's style. It's not really what he's going to. He is super good on the champions that he gets to play, though. Does remind me a lot of a player like Cream over in the LPL, and I think that is a good sign. Closer was fantastic this series. He's going to get my player of the series, most notably, again, for that Aurelia game in game number 3, where he just completely obliterated everyone on the map, whether it was Effort on the Soraka, who was dying on repeat to Aurelia, whether it was Karis on this Victor, who had no business even playing in lane against him. It didn't really matter who he was going up against. Closer was dominant there. Credit to Bertle as well. I actually thought he was maybe the most consistent player for SANDBOX over the course of these 3 games. He was really, really good in this series. It is good to see Bertle having a nice bounce back year. This is really the first time that we've seen Bertle on a team without, like, a ridiculous amount of expectations surrounding him, and I think that's hugely positive for him overall as a player. He can finally just kind of be a top laner and not worry about being a weak link for a team that is trying to make worlds, right? Everything he does is a positive for the team, and I think that's been shown. He was really good at the end of game 2 on that Fiora, and he was really impactful in game number 3 on the Cassante, just better than Morgan by a considerable amount. If he plays like this for the rest of the year, Liiv SANDBOX is going to outperform a lot of expectations. Closer is growing. He's becoming more consistent with those good games. you know, one thing I always said about Closer, I don't want to take away his ability. I was always lower on Closer because it was the consistency with which he showed that ability at an LCK level, which I was a little frustrated by. It was never those games. He always had those games where he looked like a better mid than even some of the best mids in the region. It was just being able to do that on a consistent basis that I had problems with. He is having a much easier time doing that at the beginning of the season now. It'll be interesting to see what happens when he starts going up against some of the better mids in the entire region. Didn't look particularly great against Showmaker early on in the year, but that's fine. Like, it's Showmaker, whatever. I do just like how he has performed against players like Karis, and I'm hoping he's going to be able to build on that into the future. And then credit to Kale. He continues to be incredibly impactful as these more annoying supports. He is one of the better supports and one of the more underrated players in the LCK, in my opinion, and he continued to prove that in this series. As for Bro, frustrating loss. I actually thought Umti was super good in the series, both on the Sedge and on the Elise, especially in games 1 and 2. Obviously, game 3 was a little bit of a wash for everybody on Bro, but for the most part, Umti was actually really, really solid. I would expect him to continue to be a power point on the map for Bro. Hopefully, he can continue this form and not regress to kind of what he has been over the past 2 years, because this really is the best version of Umti that I think Bro has had on their roster. Hanwha continues to be fine, not necessarily dominant. This was probably his worst series of the year. Karis, although, you know, on the opposite of that, I thought performed a little bit better than he normally does, especially in game number 1. I thought the Rise was actually really impactful along with that Sejuani. Hopefully he can continue to build. I'm very worried about Karis in a long-term sense. I just don't think he's ever going to be that good of a mid laner at an LCK level, but game number 1 does show that he still has the potential to at least play well at this level. But my dud of the series is going to go to Effort. 2 games of Soraka that just did not work out. I think the first time it didn't work, I would probably have pivoted off. He was way, way too vulnerable in game number 3. Aurelia took so much advantage of that. Soraka was able to completely farm her for gold in the mid part of this game, and that really started the snowball to get Closer out of control. And so for the most part, Effort definitely needed to be on something maybe a little bit more substantial than the Soraka. I don't hate Soraka as a pick, but I just don't think this was the comp to play it into. This was the game to play it, especially blind, and so Effort is going to get my dud of the series, although it is worth noting, Hanwha and Effort have surprisingly been a pretty stable bot lane for Bro. They just probably played their worst series here. Overall, looking at both of these teams, Bro is a team that I would expect to be exactly where they are. They're sitting at about 2-2, one of the better teams right outside the playoff hunt. I think that's probably where they are. Slightly better than the worst teams in the league, but probably not good enough to end up making playoffs. That just seems kind of where this roster is destined to head if Umti continues to play the way that he does. I could see them falling off. I could see them easily becoming one of the worst teams in the league if they start losing a bunch of games in a row and their confidence shatters and they're just not able to keep up. I could definitely see that being a possibility, but I think more realistically, this is kind of the zone they'll fall in. Not good enough to compete with teams like SANDBOX, but probably better than teams like KDF, right? That kind of zone. But for SANDBOX in particular, I mean, they are outperforming pretty much every expectation. These wins, I do want to point out, aren't the most satisfying in the entire world. So I am still relatively hesitant on saying that this is a team that is, like, good. But I think compared to what the rest of the LCK is doing right now, SANDBOX is miles ahead in terms of confidence of anybody else that isn't, like, the big 3 in the LCK right now. And so I would expect SANDBOX to continue to be a team that kind of pushes forward. I'm not sure they're a top 4 team. I'm not sure I'm on that bandwagon just yet, but they are looking good as of right now, and you just hope that they can use these, you know, wins that they're picking up against some teams that are maybe in a little bit of dysfunction right now to propel their confidence up and to have them continue to grow into being one of those teams that could genuinely compete with the top 3. That's going to bring us to our final day of games here in LCK Week 2. And we kicked off the final day with another clash of teams that I think I was really looking forward to seeing on paper, but maybe not so much with how they have performed in recent memory. We had a matchup between Hanwha Live Esports and Gen.G. A matchup between 2 teams that aren't necessarily on the same trajectory right now. One of them playing relatively well, the other not so much in Hanwha's case, but was this series close? Kind of. Gen.G was able to take it in 3 games, but it was only really close because of some mistakes from Gen.G. I'm still entirely concerned with how Hanwha Life is playing, and we'll get to that. Starting off with Game 1 analysis, Game 1 goes to the direction of Gen.G, and this honestly was a bit of a skill check game. You've got Chovy on the Aurelia, you've got Pez on something like the Jhin, which typically isn't going to be doing a lot of damage, but he is playing so ridiculously aggressive that, quite frankly, he's just out-damaging Viper by pure positioning alone. It's very impressive to watch, but for the most part, I think it's Pez, Chovy, and Peanut that really stand out in game number 1. In my opinion, if you're looking at a game number 1 MVP, it's probably going to go to Pez on the Jhin, just because I was so underwhelmed by Jhin as a champion, generally speaking, and so for him to go into this game and do as much damage as he did was really impressive, but Chovy, I thought, played really well on the Aurelia in that same vein. Game number 2, though, does go the way of Hanwha. This is a big win for them because They had looked so ridiculously incompetent earlier in the week. I was concerned after game 1 that they were just going to have this lay down and die 0-4 week. I think them showing up in game number 2 and at least being able to take a game is super positive. We'll get to someone like Klid in a second, but Klid was atrocious in game 1, and he had a much better game in game number 2. He gets on the Vi, which is something that I do think he has a little bit more proactivity in, even though I don't think Vi is as good of a champion as Sejuani is. I think maybe for someone who's struggling in the way that Klid in particular is struggling right now, Vi might be a pick that he is going to go to over Sejuani, because he looked awful in game number 1, and he looked a lot better in game number 2. I think you could make a real argument he was the best player in game number 2, but I think Broadcast gave it to Zeka on the Talia. I don't hate that. I think Viper had a much better game on the Zeri than he did on the Varus, and we'll talk about that. His Varus build ended up really not working out in this series, but we'll get to that. But I will say, Klid and Zeka, much better in game number 2. They've been not on the same page, I would say, throughout the beginning of the season. Game number 2 is probably their best game as a duo so far. But game number 3, right back in that direction of Gen.G. It very much felt, you know, I'm not going to say this, but it very much felt like game 2 was kind of a limit testing game for Gen.G. Less so than Klid and Zeka really taking over the map. It was more so like Pez out of position and Peanut making a ton of risky plays and Doran team fighting on Fiora instead of split pushing. Like, it felt like a lot of Gen.G just more so kind of not respecting Hanwha Life than it did Hanwha Life actively winning the game. And so Gen.G down, or I guess tied 1-1 going into game number 3. They definitely probably felt the pressure to just win the game, and so that's what they did. Pez continued to play ridiculously aggressive on the Lucian this time in game number 3. I think a lot of people are going to give him player of the series, but for me, he made so many positioning mistakes in game number 3 that he got caught for, that it's hard for me to give him player of the series, even though he did a ridiculous amount of damage and almost doubled what Viper was able to do in the game. I just think some of the positioning mistakes were a little bit too much for me, which is why I'm going to give player of the series to Peanut, who I think just controlled the series incredibly beautifully. Yes, Klid had a good game in game number 2, but it's not like Peanut played particularly bad. And I think games number 1 and 3 were so dominant from him, especially game 3 on this Wukong, that it felt like such a no-brainer to give Peanut the MVP. He was so positive for Gen.G overall, and he made basically no mistakes over the course of the series. Chovy was able to get so much done on the Azir, more so than anything Zeka was able to do on the Kassadin, which I'll talk about that. Zeka's Kassadin in game 3 was awful, but Chovy was able to get so much done on the Azir because he knew he had the backup and the reinforcements with Peanut on that Wukong, who was always going to be there. And then Pez was just smurfing in the bot lane. Like, he honestly is just that good. He was just outplaying Viper, and it really wasn't all that close. It's a very impressive showing from a very young player that has had a ridiculously good start to the year, and I would honestly expect that to continue. A very, very good start to the year for Pez, and a really good series from Peanut overall. As for Hanwha Life, frustrating. I mean, you're at the point in the season, you're sitting now at 1-3, not how you wanted to start the first 2 weeks, but really, it's a lot of your players that are disappointing. Klid, Viper, and Life in particular have just not been good. Kingen can be added to that list as well. He has also just, quite frankly, been bad. Basically, everybody except for Zeka, and I don't think Zeka has particularly been dominant either, has just been bad for this team. I'm going to give dud of the series to Life, although I think theoretically you could give it to Klid. I just liked Klid's game 2 a little more than I liked Life's game 2, and I think they were equally as bad in games 1 and 3. Life just doesn't really know how to play Ashe, and that is super apparent when you watch him play champions like this, where he is just, quite frankly, inept at the champion. Him and Viper have no chemistry. I talked about this in the previous entry where it's like, they haven't, you know, succeeded in building chemistry yet. I think it's honestly worse than that. They don't have chemistry. I would be surprised if this bot lane, like, developed chemistry as the year goes on. Maybe they will be able to, like, maybe the talent will just kind of seep through, and generally speaking, they'll be able to win lane because both players are good, but they hold each other back. Like, both of them feel like they make each other worse, which is certainly not what you wanted to say for this HLE bot lane, but it's not going to get better until things drastically change, and that's not a good sign because Klid continues to maybe just be the worst jungler in the league. He's actively detrimental to his team on a pick as safe as Sejuani. That's not what you want to see. Kingen is nothing in the top lane. He's not positive. He can be negative. Like, this is very much 2020 BLG Kingen all over again, which is frustrating. And even when Zeka does play well, I think he played well in game 2. I think he's had moments over the course of this year where he's played well, especially in week 1. He also has some games like game 3 Kassadin where he is just, I mean, he hits the level spike and he just does no damage. Like, he's not playing aggressive. He's not playing with the winning mentality. It feels like everybody's mental on HLE is just so boomed, it's so broken at this point that they don't even know how to or if they want to win games, and that's got to be frustrating if you're an HLE fan. I think looking at the outlooks of these two teams, HLE is going to continue to struggle until something clicks, until something changes. The talent is here on this team. If Viper and Life can get it together, even if Klid continues to be a problem and if Kingen continues to be a problem, if Viper and Life can get it together, this team is going to be good enough to be top 6 with how disastrous the rest of the LCK is right now. Zeka is good enough to just be a decent mid at worst, right? Like, he's been the most consistent member of this team, but you just need some things to click. If Click can get back into place, if Viper and Liiv can get back into place, you just need one of these things to happen, because the competition in the LCK right now, quite frankly, just isn't there. There are not 6 caliber playoff teams that are left in the LCK. There just aren't, and so you can still sneak your way in there if you just get some of these players to finally hit their potential. It's just not happening right now. As for Gen.G, they have, in my opinion, confirmed themselves in the top 3. They really don't look like a team that is going to be on the same level as T1 and DK. Game 2 kind of shows that for me. They took them way too lackadaisically in game number 2 for them to be a top-tier team, but they are, in my opinion, miles better at their best than pretty much anybody outside of the top 3. They feel very much sandwiched in their own little A tier at number 3, and I think that's probably where they'll stay for a while. That doesn't mean that they're not a good team and that they can't give teams like T1 and DK, problems as the season goes on. I think Pez, in particular, has shown that he could be a very dangerous player and potentially an MVP candidate if things move on, but Gen.G just doesn't feel like they have the firepower and the consistency to be able to compete with the top teams. That doesn't mean, again, that they're bad, just maybe that they're not the best. That's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in this video, and it was a battle between 2 0-3 teams, both teams going 1-6 in their first 7 games, and it was a matchup between the Kwangdong Freecs and DRX, and you know what? DRX did it. They won a series, and I'm so proud of them. They actually pulled it out. There is no reason that this should have ever been close, and you know what? To their credit, it wasn't, and that's got to feel good. Game 1 was a little bit back and forth, quote-unquote, but I even think for the most part in game number 1, it was pretty clear who the better team was, which was DRX, and thank God for that. I mean, if you go against KDF and you don't look dominant, like, that's not a good sign with how KDF are playing right now, so again, I'm going to skip the game-by-game recaps. I'm just going to kind of talk about these two teams because the games aren't particularly interesting to talk about. There aren't big plays or surprising feats or anything like that. I guess in a smaller sense, Rascal was really good in game number 1. Fate and Krako were really good in game number 2. That's kind of the big, overarching story. But for the most part, it was topside here for DRX that really did get them their win. My player of the series for DRX here is going to go to Fate in the mid lane. This is where he was at. Like, oh my god, Krako and Fate genuinely might have been the worst jungle mid duo in the entire league going into this series, and they actually had a good series. They started to look like the players that they were going into 2023 in this series for the first time on this organization, and that's what you wanted to see. You just wanted to see a sign of life. Like, I don't need to have them be that every game, right? If they're like a mid-tier to a lower-tier jungle mid-duo, that's fine, but you gotta have some sign that these two can still play at an LCK level in the same team, and this was it. This was the sign that they can do that. Fate was really freaking good on Sylas in game 2. He was able to secure objectives, he was able to secure kills, he was just dominant in this series overall. I've always been lower on Fate than I think other analysts have been. I think he has always been a good player. I don't think he has ever been a great player. I think he has been solid at the LCK level, someone that definitely deserves an LCK spot, but never someone that I have considered in the conversation for being one of the best players in the region. I think this was a really good performance from him, something that we really don't see a lot from him, at least in recent years. This has not been the Fate that we've been getting. He's a facilitator and not a carry. However, in this game, he certainly was willing to carry, most specifically that game 2 on the Sylas. Krako had a great bounce back. He has been maybe the worst player outside of Clid in the LCK to start the year. Great series from him. Sejuani, Wukong, it didn't matter. Both games controlled by Krako. He was just so much better than Gen.G, who, again, was probably the best player on KDF, but Krako was being able to control the map. This felt so much more similar to what SANDBOX was doing last year, where Krako was this facilitator for one lane, where he was making sure this one lane got super far ahead. In game number 1, it was Rascal in the top lane on this Cassante. Game number 2, it was Fate on the Sylas. And then Rascal, again, I think he's been the best performing member of this DRX team as the season has begun. I'm not exactly sure if that's going to keep up as the season progresses, but at least as we're sitting here now, the top side of the map looked really good in this series. If you do have some question marks about DRX, it's going to come in the bot lane and not decked him. I thought the Sivir and the Varus were fine. His positioning was really good in the series. He was never really in a position where he could be taken advantage of, and he was so much better than Taiyun that it really wasn't all that close. Where I began to have problems is Beryl. 2 games of Caitlyn support. I see he's been watching T1 Keria play a bit. He wants to pull it out against KDF as well. The problem is, Beryl was bad in this series. I think Beryl is super duper lucky that DRX was just better across the board because Beryl ran it. He sprinted it in this series. And this is kind of the Beryl that we got used to in 2022 for this DRX team. When you were looking at players like Zeka and players like Deft playing really well on DRX for a majority of last year, and then Beryl would just have these games where he would completely run it, especially if the rest of his team was playing well. That very much felt like Beryl in this series. He was the cause of most of their problems in game number 1 on this Caitlyn. If he had played basically anything else, I think it would have been fine. This does increase my opinion of KIA exponentially with how important KIA was in that game on Caitlyn. Watching Beryl try to play it for 2 games was disastrous, and so it makes me respect KIA even more, but Beryl did his absolute best to try to throw this game away, but credit to the top side, credit to Rascal, credit to Fate to be the carries, and credit to Krako to make sure that those 2 players could really get on the picks that made them most comfortable and get them in positions where they could win the game. As for KDF, they're just bad. Like, there's really not a lot I can say about this team at this point. They're 0-4, they're 1-8, they've played some of the worst teams in the league. I don't really know what else to say. They don't really have a lot going for them. Moham is going to get my dud of the series here, just like he did in Series 1. Somehow, even against a Caitlyn, Moham was less impactful, and that is not a good sign to say. Varus Karma should be something that can really punish the Sivir Caitlyn early on, even with the Umbral Glaive, you know, big lane advantage that you hit once you get that 1-item power spike. Even Ashe Karma should be able to do a lot in laning phase, should be able to at least exert some level of pressure in the bot lane, and they just weren't able to do any of that. I want to take a quick aside to talk about Roa Victor. Don't build Roa on Victor. That's a champion that needs to do damage for him to be at all relevant, and Roa does not do damage. I know they buffed the item, but it's not enough to make it viable, in my opinion, on these champions that really need to have some level of mid-game impact, or else they're just going to get out-macroed, which is essentially what happened to Bulldog in this game. It didn't matter if he showed up to fights. He was so much less impactful than the Akali in that game number 1 and in the Sylas in game number 2. That essentially he wasn't even. Like, it didn't matter that he was even. He was behind because his items were useless. And then, shout out to the Gwen in the top lane. We are going to continue to see Gwen picked as a quote-unquote counter pick to K'Sante. It currently has a 0% win rate into K'Sante globally in major regions. And so, I don't really know when we're going to give up on this. I think it's been like 8 or 9 games, and it is won 0 of the games into K'Sante. I'm not exactly sure when we're just going to be like, okay, it's not working. Like, K'Sante is just too strong to counter it with the Tank Buster. We might as well just play something else. But teams just keep going to it and they keep losing. So, mad respect. Honestly, KDF just doesn't really have all that much. Taiyun and Moham are the worst bot lane in the league, and it is not particularly close. They have 0 strengths, in my opinion, and they are constantly getting run over by everyone. Bulldog shows promise, but he consistently puts himself in positions where he's not actively that useful in the game. Youngjae, as a jungler, I think is okay. I certainly don't think he's the worst player on the team. And Dudu has regressed back to, you know, 2020, 2021 Dudu instead of what he was last year, where he honestly probably was the best player on a really terrible Hanwha Life team. He has not been that for KDF. He has just been useless in the top lane. Overall, KDF has shown, like, nothing over the course of the year. They are so clearly the worst team in the LCK, in my opinion. I would honestly imagine that a lot of challenger teams would be better than them with how I've seen them play over the course of the year so far. Hopefully, one of these players can break out, but I think you would be crazy if you thought this team was ever going to kind of get it together and get to that playoff spot. I mean, I'd love to be wrong, but they just have shown literally nothing, especially this bot lane. I would not expect KDF to go anything but, like, 10th place for the rest of the split. As for DRX, you needed this win. I know it's against the worst team in the entire league, but you needed this win. If you didn't pick this up, I was going to be hitting the full panic button like this team is doomed. You need to completely, you know, rearrange the roster. I think at least having a performance like this where some of the players that weren't performing like Krako and Fate actually did show up and actually did play kind of okay gives me the confidence to say that, like, okay, maybe give it some time. Maybe they can get their confidence back and start to play a little bit better as the year goes on. I'm not fully going to buy into DRX by any means. They just got 3-0'd by Nongshim earlier in the week, but this is the performance that I needed to see in order to feel more confident about them as a team overall, and thankfully, they at least delivered that. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCK Week 2 overview and analysis of all 10 series across all 5 days. Up on your screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCK standings, of course. Any ties will just be broken alphabetically. Lucky, I don't think there are any ties. I actually think this is just straight 1 to 10 right now, which is pretty good. In the first column to the right, you're going to see my updated power ranking numbers. On the column right next to that, you're going to see how that has changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. The biggest riser this week, SANDBOX. They're going up from number 8 in my power rankings to number 5. I was really concerned with how easily they lost to Dplus earlier in week 1, but they definitely turned it around here in week 2, looking really good. They picked up crucial wins on a KT Rolster side that, quite frankly, they should have lost to, but they didn't, which is important, and a Bro side, which they should have beaten. Two series that I think they're going to look back on and feel pretty confident that they were able to take a win off of both, so they're going to jump up from number 8 to number 5 for me. Other risers, KT going from 5 to 4, that has more to do with teams around them rather than what KT is doing. I think they are ridiculously inconsistent, but at the very least, they can win games, and I think that's more than I can say for pretty much every team below 4, even, 5 at the very least. And then the other riser is Nongshim jumping up to 8. They 3-0'd DRX, so they're going to be above them in the power rankings as of now. I think DRX should be better than them, but for now, Nongshim's going to sit at number 8 because they 3-0'd him this week. I have hardly a justification to do anything otherwise. The two followers this week, they're both big ones. DRX dropping down from number 6 to number 9. They have just completely fallen off a cliff. Yes, they had that big one over KDF, but everybody's beating KDF. Everybody should be beating KDF. They got 3-0'd by Nongshim. They deserve to be at number 9 until they prove that they can actually beat a relevant team here in the LCK. And then Hanwha dropping to number 6. This is a team that has the talent to be top 4, top 3, even if everything comes together. They just have not been there. I think a lot of people are going to look at this and say, how can you still have them in your top 6? Find me a team that deserves to be in top 6. That isn't. Like, genuinely speaking, there are not 6 teams in the LCK that deserve to be top 6 right now. Top 5, I get. Like, all of the top 5 I feel pretty locked in. T1, DK, Gen.G, KT, SANDBOX. Those 5 teams probably do deserve to be considered playoff teams right now. The other 5 do not. So go ahead, take your pick. Whichever one you want in 6, go ahead and put them there. I think Hanwha has the highest ceiling, and so for me, until they just prove that until someone else proves that they deserve to be in that spot, Hanwha's going to sit in there because I think they're the most likely to take that spot by the end of the split, but they certainly haven't shown it. And so those are my updated power rankings. Time to talk about my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week 2. Player of the week should be no surprise with how I've talked about him. KIA is going to get the player of the week on T1, the support on T1. I mean, just what a week. I mean, Caitlyn, Kalista, he's making these champions look utterly broken with Umbroglaive in the support position and being able to poke out in lane, being able to dominate in team fights. He's just that much better than everyone he's playing against. We've seen other players try to pull this out, not only in this region, but in other regions as well with things like the Jhin support, and it's just not working. That is the difference between KIA and an average support player. He is that much better. Right now, I think he has a pretty decent case to be considered the MVP of the league through the first 3 weeks of the season, and it's because of the flash, it's because of the usefulness. He has been phenomenal. So KIA definitely deserving my player of the week here in week 2. And my dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go back-to-back weeks to a player on Hanwha Life. This time, instead of Clid, it's going to be Liiv in the support position. Support with player of the week, support with dud of the week. Liiv was horrendously bad this week. This is not the Liiv that we thought we were going to get. He was actually really solid last year. I thought he made aiming look a lot better as a player. I think he added to the stability of what he was able to do. Not that aiming's bad. Aiming's a better player than Liiv, clearly. But going to Hanwha Life, him and Viper have not clicked even a little bit, and Liiv definitely struggled a lot this week. He's going to need to bounce back. That bot lane and that team in general is just going to need to bounce back if it wants to be anywhere close to where its ambitions probably were. And so, player of the week is KIA. Dud of the week is Liiv for me. But that is going to do it. If you guys enjoyed the video, let me know down in the comment section below. Who am I overrating? Who am I underrating in my power rankings? I love to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions on it. Of course, make it discussion-oriented rather than just this is the correct opinion. This is always it's an opinion at the end of the day. We're all going to have our own, and I think it's fun to have discussions about them, but they are opinions at the end of the day. You guys have been pretty great with that, especially recently. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. I post weekly recaps, not only of the LCK, but of all 4 of the major regions and the NACL. Also, of course, if you made it this far, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot to the channel, and it does help me grow a lot. Also, like I said at the beginning of the video, check out the TikTok. It's in the link in the description, and the YouTube shorts here on the channel. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.